Chapter 43 of 10 Years Later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 10 Years Later by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 43. The King's Secret. On his way, Louis met the Comte de Saint Aignan. "Well, Saint Aignan," he inquired with affected interest, "how is the invalid?" "Really, sire," stammered Saint Aignan, "to my shame, I confess I do not know." "What! you do not know?" said the king, pretending to take in a serious manner this want of attention for the object of his predilection. "Will your majesty pardon me, but I have just met one of our three loquacious wood nymphs, and I confess that my attention has been taken away from other matters." "Ah!" said the king, eagerly, "you have found, then—" "The one who deigned to speak of me in such advantageous terms. And having found mine, I was searching for yours, sire, when I had the happiness to meet your majesty." "Very well, but Mademoiselle de la Valliere before everything else," said the king, faithful to the character he had assumed. "Oh! our charming invalid," said Saint Aignan. "How fortunately her fainting fit came on, since your majesty had already occupied yourself about her." "What is the name of your fair lady, Saint Aignan? Is it a secret?" "It ought to be a secret, and a very great one even; but your majesty is well aware that no secret can possibly exist for you." "Well, what is her name?" "Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente." "Is she pretty?" "Exceedingly, sire." And I recognized the voice which pronounced my name in such tender accents. I accosted her, questioned her as well as I was able to do, in the midst of the crowd, and she told me, without suspecting anything, that a little while ago she was under the great oak, with her two friends, when the sound of a wolf or a robber had terrified them, and made them run away. "But," inquired the king, anxiously, "what are the names of these two friends?" "Sire," said Saint Aignan, "will your majesty send me forthwith to the Bastile?" "What for?" "Because I am an egotist and a fool. My surprise was so great at such a conquest, and at so fortunate a discovery, that I went no further in my inquiries. Besides, I did not think that your majesty would attach any very great importance to what you heard, knowing how much your attention was taken up by Mademoiselle de la Valliere; and then Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente left me precipitately, to return to Mademoiselle de la Valliere." "Let us hope, then, that I shall be as fortunate as yourself. Come, Saint Aignan." "Your majesty is ambitious, I perceive, and does not wish to allow any conquest to escape you. Well, I assure you that I will conscientiously set about my inquiries; and, moreover, from one or the other of these three graces we shall learn the names of the rest, and by the names their secrets." "I, too," said the king, "only require to hear her voice to know it again. Come, let us say no more about it, but show me where poor La Valliere is." "Well," thought Saint Aignan, "the king's regard is beginning to display itself, and for that girl, too. It is extraordinary, I should never have believed it." And with this thought passing through his mind, he showed the king the room to which La Valliere had been carried. The king entered, followed by Saint Aignan. In a low chamber, near a large window looking out upon the gardens, La Valliere, reclining in a large armchair, was inhaling deep draughts of the perfumed evening breeze. From the loosened body of her dress, the lace fell in tumbled folds, mingling with the tresses of her beautiful fair hair, which lay scattered upon her shoulders. Her languishing eyes were filled with tears. She seemed as lifeless as those beautiful visions of our dreams that pass before the mental eye of the sleeper, half opening their wings without moving them, unclosing their lips without a sound escaping them. The pearl-like pallor of La Valliere possessed a charm it would be impossible to describe. Mental and bodily suffering had produced upon her features a soft and noble expression of grief. From the perfect passiveness of her arms and bust, she more resembled one whose soul had passed away than a living being. She seemed not to hear either of the whisperings which arose from the court. She seemed to be communing within herself, and her beautiful, delicate hands trembled from time to time as though at the contact of some invisible touch. She was so completely absorbed in her reverie that the king entered without her perceiving him. At a distance he gazed upon her lovely face, upon which the moon shed its pure silvery light. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed, with a terror he could not control, "she is dead!" "No, sire," said Montalais, in a low voice; "on the contrary, she is better. Are you not better, Louise?" But Louise could not answer. "Louise," continued Montalais, "the king has deigned to express his uneasiness on your account." "The king!" exclaimed Louise, starting up abruptly, as if a string of fire had started through her frame to her heart. "The king uneasy about me?" "Yes," said Montalais. "The king is here, then?" said La Valliere, not venturing to look around her. that voice!" whispered Louis, eagerly, to Saint Aignan. "Yes, it is so," replied Saint Aignan. "Your majesty is right. It is she who declared her love for the sun." "Hush!" said the king. And then, approaching La Valliere, he said, "You are not well, Mademoiselle de la Valliere. Just now, indeed, in the park, I saw that you had fainted. How were you attacked?" "Sire," stammered out the poor girl, pale and trembling, "I really do not know." "You have been walking too far," said the king, "and fatigue, perhaps?" "No, sire," said Montalais, eagerly, answering for her friend, "it could not be from fatigue, for we passed most of the evening seated beneath the royal oak." "Under the royal oak?" returned the king, starting. "I was not deceived; it is as I thought." And he directed a look of intelligence at the comte. "Yes," said Saint Aignan, "under the royal oak, with Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente." "How do you know that?" inquired Montalais. "In a very simple way. Mademoiselle de la Tonnay Charente told me so." "In that case she probably told you the cause of Mademoiselle de la Valliere's fainting?" "Why, yes, she told me something about a wolf or a robber, I forget precisely which." La Valliere listened, her eyes fixed, her bosom heaving, as if, gifted with an acuteness of perception, she foresaw a portion of the truth. Louis imagined this attitude and agitation to be the consequence of a terror only partially reassured. "Nay, fear nothing," he said, with a rising emotion which he could not conceal. "The wolf which terrified you so much was simply a wolf with 2 legs." "It was a man, then," said Louise; "it was a man who was listening?" "Suppose it was so, mademoiselle, what great harm was there in him having listened? Is it likely that, even in your own opinion, you could have said anything that could not have been listened to?" La Valliere wrung her hands, and hid her face in them as if to hide her blushes. "In Heaven's name," she said, "who was concealed there? Who was listening?" The king advanced towards her, to take hold of one of her hands. "It was I," he said, bowing with marked respect. "Is it likely I could have frightened you?" La Valliere uttered a loud cry. For the second time her strength forsook her, and moaning with utter despair, she again fell lifeless in her chair. The king had just time to hold out his arm, so that she was partially supported by him. Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente and Montalais, who stood a few paces from the king and La Valliere, motionless and almost petrified at the recollection of their conversation with La Valliere, did not even think of offering their assistance, feeling restrained by the presence of the king, who, with one knee on the ground, held La Valliere around the waist with his arm. "You heard, sire," murmured Athenais, but the king did not reply. He remained with his eyes fixed upon La Valliere's half closed eyes, and held her quiescent hand in his own. "Of course," replied Saint Aignan, who, on his side, hoping that Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente, too, would faint, advanced towards her, holding his arms extended. "Of course, we did not even lose a single word." But the haughty Athenais was not a woman to faint easily. She darted a terrible look at Saint Aignan, and fled. Montalais, with more courage, advanced hurriedly towards Louise, and received her from the king's hands, who was already fast losing his presence of mind, as he felt his face covered by the perfumed tresses of the seemingly dying girl. "Excellent," whispered Saint Aignan. "This is indeed an adventure, and it will be my own fault if I am not the first to relate it." The king approached him, and with trembling voice and a passionate gesture said, "Not a syllable, comte." The poor king forgot that, only an hour before, he had given him a similar recommendation, but with the very opposite intention, namely, that the comte should be indiscreet. It followed, as a matter of course, that his latter recommendation was quite as unnecessary as the former. Half an hour afterwards, everybody in Fontainebleau knew that Mademoiselle de la Valliere had had a conversation under the royal oak with Montalais and Tonnay Charente, and that in this conversation she had confessed her affection for the king. It was known, also, that the king, after having manifested the uneasiness with which Mademoiselle de la Valliere's health had inspired him, had turned pale, and trembled very much as he received the beautiful girl fainting into his arms; so that it was quite agreed among the courtiers that the greatest event of the period had just been revealed, that his majesty loved Mademoiselle de la Valliere, and that, consequently, Monsieur could now sleep in perfect tranquillity. It was this, even, that the queen mother, as surprised as the others by the sudden change, hastened to tell the young queen and Philip d'Orleans; only she set to work in a different manner, by attacking them in the following way. To her daughter-in-law she said, "See, now, Therese, how very wrong you were to accuse the king. Now it is said he is devoted to some other person. Why should there be any greater truth in the report of today than in that of yesterday, or in that of yesterday than in that of today? To Monsieur, in relating to him the adventure of the royal oak, she said, 'Are you not very absurd in your jealousies, my dear Philip? It is asserted that the king is madly in love with that little La Valliere. Say nothing of it to your wife, for the queen will know all about it very soon." This latter confidential communication had an immediate result. Monsieur, who had regained his composure, went triumphantly to look after his wife, and as it was not yet midnight and the fete was to continue till 2 in the morning, he offered her his hand for a promenade. At the end of a few paces, however, the first thing he did was to disobey his mother's injunctions. "Do not tell anyone, the queen least of all," he said mysteriously, "what people say about the king." "What do they say about him?" inquired Madame. "That my brother has suddenly fallen in love." "With whom?" "With Mademoiselle de la Valliere." As it was dark, Madame could smile at her ease. "Ah!" she said, "and how long is it since this has been the case?" "For some days, it seems; but that was nothing but nonsense. It is only this evening that he has revealed his passion." "The king shows his good taste," said Madame. "In my opinion she is a very charming girl." "I verily believe you are jesting." "I? In what way?" "In any case this passion will make some one very happy, even if it be only La Valliere herself." "Really," continued the princess, "you speak as if you had read into the innermost recesses of La Valliere's heart. Who has told you that she agrees to return the king's affection?" "And who has told you that she will not return it?" "She loves the Vicomte de Bragelonne." "You think so?" "She is even affianced to him." "She was so." "What do you mean?" "When they went to ask the king's permission to arrange the marriage, he refused his permission." "Refused?" "Yes, although the request was preferred by the Comte de la Fere himself, for whom the king has the greatest regard, on account of the part he took in your royal brother's restoration, and in other events also which happened a long time ago." "Well, the poor lovers must wait until the king is pleased to change his opinion. They are young, and there is time enough." "But, dear me," said Philip, laughing, "I perceive you do not know the best part of the affair." "No?" "That by which the king was most deeply touched." "The king, do you say, has been deeply touched?" "To the very quick of his heart." "But how? In what manner? Tell me directly." "By an adventure, the romance of which cannot be equaled." "You know how I love to hear of such adventures, and yet you keep me waiting," said the princess, impatiently. "Well, then," and Monsieur paused. "I am listening." "Under the royal oak. You know where the royal oak is?" "What can that matter? Under the royal oak, you are saying?" "Well, Mademoiselle de la Valliere, fancying herself to be alone with her two friends, revealed to them her affection for the king." "Ah!" said Madame, beginning to be uneasy. "Her affection for the king?" "Yes." "When was this?" "About an hour ago." Madame started, and then said, "And no one knew of this affection?" "No one." "Not even his majesty?" "Not even his majesty. The artful little puss kept her secret strictly to herself, when suddenly it proved stronger than herself, and so escaped her." "And from whom did you get this absurd tale?" "Why, as every one else did, from La Valliere herself, who confessed her love to Montalais and Tonnay Charente, who were her companions." Madame stopped suddenly, and by a hasty movement let go her husband's hand. "Did you say it was an hour ago she made this confession?" Madame inquired. "About that time." "Is the king aware of it?" "Why, that is the very thing which constitutes the perfect romance of the affair; for the king was behind the royal oak with Saint Aignan, and heard the whole of the interesting conversation without losing a single word of it." Madame felt struck to the heart, saying incautiously, "But I have seen the king since, and he never told me a word about it." "Of course," said Monsieur, "he took care not to speak of it to you himself, since he recommended every one else not to say a word about it." "What do you mean?" said Madame, growing angry. "I mean that they wish to keep you in ignorance of the affair altogether." "But why should they wish to conceal it from me?" "From the fear that your friendship for the young queen might induce you to say something about it to her, nothing more." Madame hung down her head; her feelings were grievously wounded. She could not enjoy a moment's repose until she had met the king. As the king is, most naturally, the very last person in his kingdom who knows what is said about him, in the same way that a lover is the only one who is kept in ignorance of what is said about his mistress; therefore, when the king perceived Madame, who was looking for him, he approached her in some perturbation, but still gracious and attentive in his manner. Madame waited for him to speak about La Valliere first, but as he did not speak of her, she said, "And the poor girl?" "What poor girl?" said the king. "La Valliere. Did you not tell me, sire, that she had fainted?" "She is still very ill," said the king, affecting the greatest indifference. "But surely that will prejudicially affect the rumor you are going to spread, sire." What rumor? That your attention was taken up by her. Oh, said the king carelessly, I trust it will be reported all the same. Madame still waited. She wished to know if the king would speak to her of the adventure of the Royal Oak, but the king did not say a word about it. Madame, on her side, did not open her lips about it, so that the king took leave of her without having reposed the slightest confidence in her. Hardly had she watched the king move away, than she set out in search of Saint Aignan. Saint Aignan was never very difficult to find. He was like the smaller vessels that always follow in the wake of, and as tenders to, the larger ships. Saint Aignan was the very man whom Madame needed in her then state of mind. And as for him, he only looked for worthier ears than others he had found to have an opportunity of recounting the event in all its details, and so he did not spare Madame a single word of the whole affair. When he had finished, Madame said to him, "Confess now, that this is all a charming invention." "Invention, no. A true story, yes." "Confess, whether invention or true story, that it was told to you as you have told it to me, but that you were not there. Upon my honor, Madame, I was there." "And you think that these confessions may have made an impression on the king?" "Certainly, as those of Mademoiselle de la Tonnay Charente did upon me," replied Saint Aignan. "Do not forget, Madame, that Mademoiselle de la Valliere compared the king to the sun. That was flattering enough." "The king does not permit himself to be influenced by such flatteries." "Madame, the king is just as much Adonis as Apollo, and I saw plain enough just now when La Valliere fell into his arms." "La Valliere fell into the king's arms?" "Oh, it was the most graceful picture possible. Just imagine, La Valliere had fallen back fainting, and—" "Well, what did you see? Tell me, speak." "I saw what 10 other people saw at the same time as myself. I saw that when La Valliere fell into his arms, the king almost fainted himself." Madame smothered a subdued cry, the only indication of her smothered anger. "Thank you," she said, laughing in a convulsive manner. "You relate stories delightfully, Monsieur de Saint Aignan." And she hurried away, alone, and almost suffocated by painful emotion, towards the chateau. Chapter 43. Recording by Todd. Of 10 years later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 10 years later, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 44. Courses de nuit. Monsieur quitted the princess in the best possible humor, and feeling greatly fatigued, retired to his apartments, leaving every one to finish the night as he chose. When in his room, Monsieur began to dress for the night with careful attention, which displayed itself from time to time in paroxysms of satisfaction. While his attendants were engaged in curling his hair, he sang the principal airs of the ballet which the violins had played, and to which the king had danced. He then summoned his tailors, inspected his costumes for the next day, and, in token of his extreme satisfaction, distributed various presents among them. As, however, the Chevalier de Lorraine, who had seen the prince return to the chateau, entered the room, Monsieur overwhelmed him with kindness. The former, after having saluted the prince, remained silent for a moment, like a sharpshooter who deliberates before deciding in what direction he will renew his fire. Then, seeming to make up his mind, he said, "Have you remarked a very singular coincidence, monseigneur?" "No. What is it?" "The bad reception which his majesty, in appearance, gave the Comte de Guiche." "In appearance?" "Yes, certainly, since in reality he has restored him to favor." "I did not notice it," said the prince. "What! Did you not remark that, instead of ordering him to go away again into exile, as was natural, he encouraged him in his opposition by permitting him to resume his place in the ballet?" "And you think the king was wrong, chevalier?" said the prince. "Are you not of my opinion, prince?" "Not altogether so, my dear chevalier; and I think the king was quite right not to have made a disturbance against a poor fellow whose want of judgment is more to be complained of than his intention." "Really," said the chevalier, "as far as I am concerned, I confess that this magnanimity astonishes me to the highest degree." "Why so?" inquired Philip. "Because I should have thought the king had been more jealous," replied the chevalier spitefully. During the last few minutes Monsieur had felt that there was something of an irritating nature concealed under his favorite's remarks. This last word, however, ignited the powder. "Jealous!" exclaimed the prince. "Jealous! What do you mean? Jealous of what, if you please? Or jealous of whom?" The chevalier perceived that he had allowed an excessively mischievous remark to escape him, as he was in the habit of doing. He endeavored, therefore, apparently to recall it while it was still possible to do so. "Jealous of his authority," he said with an assumed frankness. "Of what else would you have the king jealous?" "Ah!" said the prince, "that's very proper. Did your royal highness," continued the chevalier, "solicit dear De Guiche's pardon?" "No, indeed," said Monsieur. "De Guiche is an excellent fellow, and full of courage; but as I do not approve of his conduct with Madame, I wish him neither harm nor good." The chevalier had assumed a bitterness with regard to De Guiche, as he had attempted to do with regard to the king; but he thought he perceived that the time for indulgence, and even for the utmost indifference, had arrived, and that, in order to throw some light on the question, it might be necessary for him to put the lamp, as the saying is, beneath the husband's very nose. Very well, said the chevalier to himself, I must wait for De Wardes. He will do more in one day than I in a month, for I verily believe he is even more envious than I. Then again, it is not De Wardes I require so much as that some event or other should happen, and in the whole of this affair I see none. That De Guiche returned after he had been sent away is certainly serious enough, but all its seriousness disappears when I learn that De Guiche has returned at the very moment Madame troubles herself no longer about him. Madame, in fact, is occupied with the king, that is clear, but she will not be so much longer if, as is asserted, the king has ceased to trouble his head about her. The moral of the whole matter is, to remain perfectly neutral, and await the arrival of some new caprice and let that decide the whole affair. And the chevalier thereupon settled himself resignedly in the armchair in which Monsieur permitted him to seat himself in his presence, and having no more spiteful or malicious remarks to make, the consequence was that De Lorenne's wit seemed to have deserted him. Most fortunately, Monsieur was in high good humor, and he had enough for two, until the time arrived for dismissing his servants and gentlemen of the chamber, and he passed into his sleeping apartment. As he withdrew, he desired the chevalier to present his compliments to Madame, and to say that, as the night was cool, Monsieur, who was afraid of the toothache, would not venture out again into the park during the remainder of the evening. The chevalier entered the princess's apartments at the very moment she came in herself. He acquitted himself faithfully of the commission entrusted to him, and, in the first place, remarked all the indifference and annoyance with which Madame received her husband's communication, a circumstance which appeared to him fraught with something fresh. If Madame had been about to leave her apartments with that strangeness of manner, he would have followed her, but she was returning to them. There was nothing to be done, therefore he turned upon his heel like an unemployed heron, appearing to question earth, air, and water about it, shook his head, and walked away mechanically in the direction of the gardens. He had hardly gone 100 paces when he met two young men, walking arm in arm, with their heads bent down, and idly kicking the small stones out of their path as they walked on, plunged in thought. It was De Guiche and De Bragelonne, the sight of whom, as it always did, produced upon the chevalier, instinctively, a feeling of repugnance. He did not, however, the less, on that account, salute them with a very low bow, which they returned with interest. Then, observing that the park was nearly deserted, that the illuminations began to burn out, and that the morning breeze was setting in, he turned to the left, and entered the chateau again by one of the smaller courtyards. The others turned aside to the right, and continued on their way towards the large park. As the chevalier was ascending the side staircase which led to the private entrance, he saw a woman, followed by another, make her appearance under the arcade which led from the small to the large courtyard. The two women walked so fast that the rustling of their dresses could be distinguished through the silence of the night. The style of their mantles, their graceful figures, a mysterious yet haughty carriage which distinguished them both, especially the one who walked first, struck the chevalier. "I certainly know those two," he said to himself, pausing upon the top step of the small staircase. Then, as with the instinct of a bloodhound he was about to follow them, one of the servants who had been running after him arrested his attention. "Monsieur," he said, "the courier has arrived." "Very well," said the chevalier, "there is time enough; tomorrow will do." "There are some urgent letters which you would be glad to see, perhaps." "From where?" inquired the chevalier. "One from England, and the other from Calais. The latter arrived by express, and seems of great importance." "From Calais? Who the deuce can have to write to me from Calais? I think I recognize the handwriting of Monsieur le Comte de Wardes." "Oh!" cried the chevalier, forgetting his intention of acting the spy, "in that case I will come up at once." This he did, while the two unknown beings disappeared at the end of the court opposite to the one by which they had just entered. We shall now follow them, and leave the chevalier undisturbed to his correspondence. When they had arrived at the grove of trees, the foremost of the two halted, somewhat out of breath, and, cautiously raising her hood, said, "Are we still far from the tree?" "Yes, madame, more than 500 paces; but pray rest a while, you will not be able to walk much longer at this rate." "You are right," said the princess, for it was she, and she leaned against a tree. And now," she resumed, after having recovered her breath, "tell me the whole truth, and conceal nothing from me." "Oh, Madame," cried the young girl, "you are already angry with me." "No, my dear Athenais, reassure yourself, I am in no way angry with you. After all, these things do not concern me personally. You are anxious about what you might have said under the oak; you are afraid of having offended the king, and I wish to tranquilize you by ascertaining myself if it were possible you could have been overheard." "Oh, yes, Madame, the king was close to us." "Still, you were not speaking so loud that some of your remarks may not have been lost." "We thought we were quite alone, Madame." "There were three of you, you say?" "Yes, La Valliere, Montalais, and myself." "And you, individually, spoke in a light manner of the king?" "I am afraid so. Should such be the case, will your highness have the kindness to make my peace with his majesty?" "If there should be any occasion for it, I promise you I will do so. However, as I have already told you, it will be better not to anticipate evil. The night is now very dark, and the darkness is still greater under the trees. It is not likely you were recognized by the king. To inform him of it, by being the first to speak, is to denounce yourself." "Oh, Madame, Madame, if Mademoiselle de la Valliere were recognized, I must have been recognized also. Besides, M. de Saint Aignan left no doubt on the subject." "Did you, then, say anything very disrespectful of the king?" "Not at all. It was one of the others who made some very flattering speeches about the king, and my remarks must have been very much in contrast to hers." "Montalais is such a giddy girl," said Madame. "It was not Montalais. Montalais said nothing; it was La Valliere." Madame started as if she had not known it perfectly well already. "No, no," she said, "the king cannot have heard. Besides, we will now try the experiment for which we came out. Show me the oak. Do you know where it is?" she continued. "Alas, Madame, yes." "And you can find it again?" "With my eyes shut." "Very well. Sit down on the bank where you were, where La Valliere was, and speak in the same tone and to the same effect as you did before. I will conceal myself in the thicket, and if I can hear you, I will tell you so." "Yes, Madame." "If, therefore, you really spoke loud enough for the king to have heard you, in that case—" Athenais seemed to await the conclusion of the sentence with some anxiety. "In that case," said Madame, in a suffocated voice, arising doubtless from her hurried progress, "in that case, I forbid you—" And Madame again increased her pace. Suddenly, however, she stopped. "An idea occurs to me," she said. "A good idea, no doubt, Madame," replied Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente. "Montalais must be as much embarrassed as La Valliere and yourself." "Less so, for she is less compromised, having said less." "That does not matter. She will help you, I dare say, by deviating a little from the exact truth, especially if she knows that your highness is kind enough to interest yourself about me." "Very well. I think I have discovered what it is best for you all to pretend." "How delightful!" "You had better say that all three of you were perfectly well aware that the king was behind the tree, or behind the thicket, whichever it may have been, and that you knew M. de Saint Aignan was there too." "Yes, Madame; for you cannot disguise it from yourself, Athenais. Saint Aignan takes advantage of some very flattering remarks you made about him." "Well, Madame, you see very clearly that one can be overheard," cried Athenais, "since M. de Saint Aignan overheard us." Madame bit her lips, for she had thoughtlessly committed herself. "Oh, you know Saint Aignan's character very well," she said. "The favor the king shows him almost turns his brain, and he talks at random. Not only so, he very often invents. That is not the question. The fact remains, did, or did not, the king overhear?" "Oh, yes, Madame, he certainly did," said Athenais, in despair. "In that case, do what I said. Maintain boldly that all three of you knew, mind, all three of you, for if there is any doubt about any one of you, there will be doubt about all. Persist, I say, that you knew that the king and M. de Saint Aignan were there, and that you wished to amuse yourself at the expense of those who were listening." "Oh, Madame, at the king's expense? We shall never dare say that." "It is a simple jest, an innocent deception readily permitted in young girls whom men wish to take by surprise. In this manner everything explains itself. What Montalais said of Malicorne, the mere jest; what you said of M. de Saint Aignan, a mere jest too; and what La Valliere may have said of—" "And which she would have given anything to recall." "Are you sure of that?" "Perfectly." "Very well, an additional reason. Say the whole affair was a mere joke. M. de Malicorne will have no occasion to get out of temper. M. de Saint Aignan will be completely put out of countenance; he will be laughed at instead of you; and lastly, the king will be punished for a curiosity unworthy of his rank. Let people laugh a little at the king in this affair, and I do not think he will complain of it." "Oh, Madame, you are indeed an angel of goodness and sense." "It is to my own advantage." "In what way?" "How can you ask me why it is to my advantage to spare my maids of honor the remarks, annoyance, perhaps even calumnies that might follow? Alas! you well know that the court has no indulgence for this sort of peccadillo. But we have now been walking for some time. Shall we be long before we reach it?" "About 50 or 60 paces further. Turn to the left, Madame, if you please." "And you are sure of Montalais?" said Madame. "Oh, certainly." "Will she do what you ask her?" "Everything; she will be delighted." "And La Valliere?" ventured the princess. "Ah! there will be some difficulty with her, Madame. She would scorn to tell a falsehood." "Yet when it is in her interest to do so?" "I am afraid that would not make the slightest difference in her ideas." "Yes, yes," said Madame, "I have been already told that. She is one of those over nice and affectedly particular people who place heaven in the foreground in order to conceal themselves behind it. But if she refuses to tell a falsehood, as she will expose herself to the jests of the whole court, as she will have annoyed the king by a confession as ridiculous as it was immodest, Mademoiselle la Baume la Blanche de la Valliere will think it but proper I should send her back again to her pigeons in the country, in order that, in Touraine yonder, or in La Blaiserie, I know not where it may be, she may at her ease study sentiment and pastoral life combined." These words were uttered with a vehemence and harshness that terrified Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente, and the consequence was, that, as far as she was concerned, she promised to tell as many falsehoods as might be necessary. It was in this frame of mind that Madame and her companion reached the precincts of the Royal Oak. "Here we are," said Tonnay Charente. "We shall soon learn if one can overhear," replied Madame. "Hush!" whispered the young girl, holding Madame back with a hurried gesture, entirely forgetful of her companion's rank. Madame stopped. "You see that you can hear," said Athenais. "How?" "Listen." Madame held her breath, and, in fact, the following words, pronounced by a gentle and melancholy voice, floated towards them: "I tell you, vicomte, I tell you I love her madly. I tell you I love her to distraction." Madame started at the voice, and beneath her hood, a bright joyous smile illuminated her features. It was she who now held back her companion, and with a light step, leading her some 20 paces away, that is to say, out of the reach of the voice, she said, "Remain here, my dear Athenais, and let no one surprise us. I think it must be you they are conversing about." "Me, Madame?" "Yes, you, or rather your adventure. I will go and listen. If we were both there, we should be discovered. Or, stay, go and fetch Montalais, and then return and wait for me with her at the entrance to the forest." And then, as Athenais hesitated, she said again, "Go!" in a voice which did not admit of reply. Athenais thereupon arranged her dress so as to prevent its rustling being heard, and by a path beyond the group of trees she regained the flower garden. As for Madame, she concealed herself in the thicket, leaning her back against a gigantic chestnut tree, one of the branches of which had been cut in a manner so as to form a seat, and waited there, full of anxiety and apprehension. "Now," she said, "since one can hear from this place, let us listen to what M. de Bragelonne and that other madly in love fool, the Comte de Guiche, have to say about me." Chapter 45.
Of 10 Years Later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eden Ray Hedrick. 10 Years Later by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 45. In which Madame acquires a proof that listeners hear what is said. There was a moment's silence, as if the mysterious sounds of the night were hushed to listen, at the same time as Madame, to the youthful, passionate disclosures of De Guiche. Raoul was about to speak. He leaned indolently against the trunk of the large oak, and replied in his sweet and musical voice, "Alas, my dear De Guiche, it is a great misfortune." "Yes," cried the latter, "great indeed." "You do not understand me, De Guiche. I say that it is a great misfortune for you, not merely loving, but not knowing how to conceal your love." "What do you mean?" said De Guiche. "Yes, you do not perceive one thing, namely, that it is no longer to the only friend you have, in other words, to a man who would rather die than betray you. You do not perceive, I say, that it is no longer to your only friend that you confide your passion, but to the first person that approaches you." "Are you mad, Bragelonne?" exclaimed De Guiche, "to say such things to me?" "The fact stands thus, however." "Impossible! How, in what manner can I have ever been indiscreet to such an extent?" "I mean that your eyes, your looks, your sighs, proclaim, in spite of yourself, that exaggerated feeling which leads and hurries a man beyond his own control. In such a case he ceases to be master of himself. He is a prey to a mad passion that makes him confide his grief to the trees or to the air from the very moment he has no longer any living being in reach of his voice. Besides, remember this: it very rarely happens that there is not always someone present to hear, especially the very things which ought not to be heard." De Guiche uttered a deep sigh. "Nay," continued Bragelonne, "you distress me. Since you return here, you have 1,000 times, and in 1,000 different ways, confessed your love for her, and yet, had you not said one word, your return alone would have been a terrible indiscretion. I persist, then, in drawing this conclusion, that if you do not place a better watch over yourself than you have hitherto done, one day or other something will happen that will cause an explosion. Who will save you then? Answer me. Who will save her? For, innocent as she will be of your affection will be an accusation against her in the hands of her enemies." "Alas!" murmured De Guiche, and a deep sigh accompanied the exclamation. "That is not answering me, De Guiche." "Yes, yes." "Well, what reply have you to make?" "This, that when the day arrives I shall be no more a living being than I feel myself now." "I do not understand you." "So many vicissitudes have worn me out. At present I am no more a thinking, acting being. At present the most worthless of men is better than I am. My remaining strength is exhausted. My latest formed resolutions have vanished, and I abandon myself to my fate. When a man is out campaigning, as we have been together, and he sets off alone and unaccompanied for a skirmish, it sometimes happens that he may meet with a party of 5 or 6 foragers, and, although alone, he defends himself. Afterwards, 5 or 6 others arrive unexpectedly. His anger is aroused, and he persists. But if 6, 8, or 10 others should be met with, he either sets spurs to his horse, if he should still happen to retain one, or lets himself be slain to save an ignominious flight. Such, indeed, is my own case. First I had to struggle against myself, afterwards against Buckingham. Now, since the king is in the field, I will not contend against the king, nor even, I wish you to understand, will the king retire, nor even against the nature of that woman. Still I do not deceive myself. Having devoted myself to the service of such a love, I lose my life in it." "It is not the lady you ought to reproach," replied Raoul, "it is yourself." "Why so?" "You know the princess's character. Somewhat giddy, easily captivated by novelty, susceptible to flattery, whether it come from a blind person or a child. And yet you allow your passion for her to eat your very life away. Look at her, love her if you will, for no one whose heart is not engaged elsewhere can see her without loving her. Yet, while you love her, respect, in the first place, her husband's rank, then herself, and lastly your own safety." "Thanks, Raoul." "What for?" "Because, seeing how much I suffer through this woman, you endeavor to console me; because you tell me of all the good of her you think, and perhaps even that which you do not think." "Oh," said Raoul, "there you are wrong, comte. What I think I do not always say, but in that case I say nothing. But when I speak, I know not how to feign or to deceive, and whoever listens to me may believe me." During this conversation, Madame, her head stretched forward with eager ear and dilated glance, endeavoring to penetrate the obscurity, thirstily drank in the faintest sound of their voices. "Oh, I know her better than you do, then," exclaimed Guiche. "She is not merely giddy, but frivolous. She is not only attracted by novelty, she is utterly oblivious, and is without faith. She is not simply susceptible to flattery, she is a practiced and cruel coquette. A thorough coquette, yes, yes, I am sure of it. Believe me, Bragelonne, I am suffering all the torments of hell. Brave, passionately fond of danger, I meet a danger greater than my strength and my courage. But believe me, Raoul, I reserve for myself a victory which shall cost her floods of tears." "A victory?" he asked. "And of what kind?" "Of what kind, you ask?" "Yes." "One day I will accost her, and will address her thus: 'I was young, madly in love. I possessed, however, sufficient respect to throw myself at your feet, and to prostrate myself in the dust if your looks had not raised me to your hand. I fancied I understood your looks. I rose, and then, without having done anything more towards you than love you yet more devotedly, if that were possible, you, a woman without heart, faith, or love, in very wantonness, dashed me down again from sheer caprice. You are unworthy, princess of the royal blood though you may be, of the love of a man of honor. I offer my life as a sacrifice for having loved you too tenderly, and I die despairing you." "Oh!" cried Raoul, terrified at the accents of profound truth which De Guiche's words betrayed. "I was right in saying you were mad, Guiche." "Yes, yes," exclaimed De Guiche, following out his own idea. "Since there are no wars here now, I will flee yonder to the north, seek service in the Empire, where some Hungarian, or Croat, or Turk will perhaps kindly put me out of my misery." De Guiche did not finish, or rather, as he finished, a sound made him start, and at the same moment caused Raoul to leap to his feet. As for De Guiche, buried in his own thoughts, he remained seated, with his head tightly pressed between his hands. The branches of the tree were pushed aside, and a woman, pale and much agitated, appeared before the two young men. With one hand she held back the branches, which would have struck her face, and with the other she raised the hood of the mantle which covered her shoulders. By her clear and lustrous glance, by her lofty carriage, by her haughty attitude, and, more than all that, by the throbbing of his own heart, De Guiche recognized Madame, and uttering a loud cry, he removed his hands from his temple and covered his eyes with them. Raoul, trembling and out of countenance, merely muttered a few words of respect. "Monsieur de Bragelonne," said the princess, "have the goodness, I beg, to see if my attendants are not somewhere yonder, either in the walks or in the groves, and you, Monsieur de Guiche, remain here. I am tired, and you will perhaps give me your arm." Had a thunderbolt fallen at the feet of the unhappy young man, he would have been less terrified than by her cold and severe tone. However, as he himself had just said, he was brave, and as in the depths of his own heart he had just decisively made up his mind, De Guiche arose, and, observing Bragelonne's hesitation, he turned towards him a glance full of resignation and grateful acknowledgement. Instead of immediately answering Madame, he even advanced a step toward the Vicomte, and, holding out the arm which the princess had just desired him to give to her, he pressed his friend's hand in his own, with a sigh, in which he seemed to give to friendship all the life that was left in the depths of his heart. Madame, who, in her pride, had never known what it was to wait, now waited until this mute colloquy was at an end. Her royal hand remained suspended in the air, and, when Raoul had left, it sank without anger, but not without emotion, in that of De Guiche. They were alone in the depths of the dark and silent forest, and nothing could be heard but Raoul's hastily retreating footsteps along the obscure paths. Over their heads was extended the thick and fragrant vault of branches, through the occasional openings of which the stars could be seen glittering in their beauty. Madame softly drew De Guiche about 100 paces away from that indiscreet tree which had heard, and had allowed so many things to be heard, during the evening, and leading him to a neighboring glade, so that they could see a certain distance around them, she said in a trembling voice, "I have brought you here, because yonder, where you were, everything can be overheard." "Everything can be overheard, did you say, Madame?" replied the young man mechanically. "Yes." "Which means," murmured De Guiche. "Which means that I have heard every syllable you said." "Oh, heaven! This only was wanting to destroy me," stammered De Guiche, and he bent down his head like an exhausted swimmer beneath the wave which engulfs him. "And so," she said, "you judge me as you have said?" De Guiche grew pale, turned his head aside, and was silent. He felt almost on the point of fainting. "I do not complain," continued the princess, in a tone full of gentleness. "I prefer frankness that wounds me to a flattery which would deceive me. And so, according to your opinion, Monsieur de Guiche, I am a coquette and a worthless creature." "Worthless!" cried the young man. "You worthless! Oh, no, most certainly I did not say, I could not have said, that that which was the most precious object in life for me could be worthless. No, no, I did not say that." "A woman who sees a man perish, consumed by the fire she has kindled, and who does not allay that fire, is, in my opinion, a worthless woman." "What can it matter to you what I have said?" returned the comte. "What am I compared to you, and why should you even trouble yourself to know whether I exist or not?" "Monsieur de Guiche, both you and I are human beings, and knowing you as I do not wish you to risk your life. With you I will change my conduct and character. I will be, not frank, for I am always so, but truthful. I implore you, therefore, to love me no more, and to forget utterly that I have ever addressed a word or a glance towards you." De Guiche turned round, and, bending a look full of passionate devotion upon her, "You," he said, "you excuse yourself, you implore me?" "Certainly, since I have done evil, I ought to repair the evil I have done. And so, comte, this is what we will agree to. You will forgive my frivolity and my coquetry. Nay, do not interrupt me. I will forgive you for having said I was frivolous and a coquette, or something worse, perhaps, and you will renounce your idea of dying, and will preserve for your family, for the king, and for our sex, a cavalier whom everyone esteems, and whom many hold dear." Madame pronounced this last word in such an accent of frankness, and even of tenderness, that poor De Guiche's heart felt almost bursting. "Oh, Madame, Madame!" he stammered out. "Nay, listen further," she continued. "When you shall have renounced all thought of me forever, from necessity in the first place, and next because you will yield to my entreaty, then you will judge me more favorably, and I am convinced you will replace this love, forgive the frivolity of the expression, by a sincere friendship, which you will be ready to offer me, and which, I promise you, shall be cordially accepted." De Guiche, his forehead bedewed with perspiration, a feeling of death in his heart, and a trembling agitation through his whole frame, bit his lip, stamped his foot on the ground, and, in a word, devoured the bitterness of his grief. "Madame," he said, "what you offer is impossible, and I cannot accept such conditions." "What?" said Madame. "Do you refuse my friendship, then?" "No, no, I do not need your friendship, Madame. I prefer to die from love than to live for friendship." "Comte!" "Oh, Madame," cried De Guiche, "the present is a moment for me in which no other consideration and no other respect exist than the consideration and respect of a man of honor towards the woman he worships. Drive me away, curse me, denounce me, you will be perfectly right. I have uttered complaints against you, but their bitterness has been owing to my passion for you. I have said I wish to die, and die I will. If I lived, you would forget me, but dead, you would never forget me, I am sure." Henrietta, who was standing buried in thought, and nearly as agitated as De Guiche himself, turned aside her head, as but a minute before he had turned aside his. Then, after a moment's pause, she said, "And you love me, then, very much?" "Madly, madly, enough to die from it, whether you drive me from you, or whether you listen to me still." "It is a hopeless case," she said, in a playful manner, "a case which must be treated with soothing application. Give me your hand, it is as cold as ice." De Guiche knelt down and pressed to his lips not one but both of Madame's hands. "Love me, then," said the princess, "since it cannot be otherwise." And almost imperceptibly she pressed his fingers, raising him thus, partly in the manner of a queen, and partly as a fond and affectionate woman would have done. De Guiche trembled from head to foot, and Madame, who felt how passion coursed through every fiber of his being, knew that he indeed truly loved. "Give me your arm, comte," she said, "and let us return." "Ah, Madame," said the comte, trembling and bewildered, "you have discovered a third way of killing me." "But happily it is the slowest way, is it not?" she replied, as she led him toward the grove of trees they had so lately quitted. Chapter 46 of 10 Years Later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eden Ray Hedrick. 10 Years Later, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 46. Aramis's Correspondence. When De Guiche's affairs, which had been suddenly set to right without his having been able to guess the cause of their improvement, assumed the unexpected aspect we have seen, Raoul, in obedience to the request of the princess, had withdrawn, in order not to interrupt an explanation, the results of which he was far from guessing, and he soon after joined the ladies of honor, who were walking about in the flower gardens. During this time, the Chevalier de Lorraine, who had returned to his own room, read De Wardes's letter with surprise, for it informed him by the hand of his valet of the sword thrust received at Calais, and of all the details of the adventure, and invited him to inform De Guiche and Monsieur, whatever there might be in the affair likely to be most disagreeable to both of them. De Wardes particularly endeavored to prove to the chevalier the violence of Madame's affection for Buckingham, and he finished his letter by declaring that he thought this feeling was returned. The chevalier shrugged his shoulders at the last paragraph, and in fact De Wardes was out of date, as we have seen. De Wardes was still only at the Buckingham affair. The chevalier threw the letter over his shoulder upon an adjoining table, and said in a disdainful tone, "It is really incredible, and yet poor De Wardes is not deficient in ability. But the truth is, it is not very apparent, so easy it is to grow rusty in the country. The deuce take the simpleton, who ought to have written to me about matters of importance, and yet he writes such silly stuff as that. If it had not been for that miserable letter, which has no meaning in it at all, I should have detected in the grove yonder a charming little intrigue, which would have compromised a woman, which might perhaps have been as good as a sword thrust for a man, and have diverted Monsieur for many days to come." He looked at his watch. "It is now too late," he said. 1 o'clock in the morning. Everyone must have returned to the king's apartments, where the night is to be finished. Well, the scent is lost, and unless some extraordinary chance—" And thus saying, as if to appeal to his good star, the chevalier, greatly out of temper, approached the window, which looked out upon a somewhat solitary part of the garden. Immediately, and as if some evil genius was at his orders, he perceived returning towards the chateau, accompanied by a man, a silk mantle of a dark color, and recognized the figure which had struck his attention half an hour previously. "Admirable!" he thought, striking his hands together. "This is my providential, mysterious affair." And he started out precipitately along the staircase, hoping to reach the courtyard in time to recognize the woman in the mantle and her companion. But as he arrived at the door of the little court, he nearly knocked against Madame, whose radiant face seemed full of charming revelations beneath the mantle which protected without concealing her. Unfortunately, Madame was alone. The chevalier knew that since he had seen her, not 5 minutes before, with a gentleman, the gentleman in question could not be far off. Consequently, he hardly took time to salute the princess as he drew up to allow her to pass. Then, when she had advanced a few steps, with the rapidity of a woman who fears recognition, and when the chevalier perceived that she was too much occupied with her own thoughts to trouble herself about him, he darted into the garden, looked hastily round on every side, and embraced within his glance as much of the horizon as he possibly could. He was just in time. The gentleman who had accompanied Madame was still in sight, only he was hurrying towards one of the wings of the chateau, behind which he was on the point of disappearing. There was not an instant to lose. The chevalier darted in pursuit of him, prepared to slacken his pace as he approached the unknown, but in spite of the diligence he used, the unknown had disappeared behind the flight of steps before he approached. It was evident, however, that the man pursued was walking quietly, in a pensive manner, with his head bent down, either beneath the weight of grief or happiness, when once the angle was passed, unless, indeed, he were to enter by some door or another, the chevalier could not fail to overtake him. And this certainly would have happened if, at the very moment he turned the angle, the chevalier had not run against 2 persons, who were themselves wheeling in the opposite direction. The chevalier was ready to seek a quarrel with these 2 troublesome intruders, when, looking up, he recognized the superintendent. Fouquet was accompanied by a person whom the chevalier now saw for the first time. This stranger was the Bishop of Vannes. Checked by the important character of the individual, and obliged out of politeness to make his own excuses when he expected to receive them, the chevalier stepped back a few paces, and, as M. Fouquet possessed, if not the friendship, at least the respect of everyone, as the king himself, although he was rather his enemy than his friend, treated M. Fouquet as a man of great consideration, the chevalier did what the king himself would have done, namely, he bowed to M. Fouquet, who returned his salutation with kindly politeness, perceiving that the gentleman had run against him by mistake, and without any intention of being rude. Then, almost immediately afterwards, having recognized the Chevalier de Lorraine, he made a few civil remarks, to which the chevalier was obliged to reply. Brief as the conversation was, de Lorraine saw, with the most unfeigned displeasure, the figure of his unknown becoming dimmer in the distance, and fast disappearing in the darkness. The chevalier resigned himself, and, once resigned, gave his entire attention to Fouquet. "You arrive late, monsieur," he said. "Your absence has occasioned me great surprise, and I heard Monsieur express himself as much astonished that, having been invited by the king, you had not come."
"It was impossible for me to do so, but I came as soon as I was free."
"Is Paris quiet?"
"Perfectly so. Paris has received the last tax very well."
"Ah, I understand you wished to assure yourself of this good feeling before you came to participate in our fetes."
"I have arrived, however, somewhat late to enjoy them. I will ask you, therefore, to inform me if the king is in the chateau or not, if I am likely to be able to see him this evening, or if I shall have to wait until tomorrow."
"We have lost sight of his majesty during the last half hour nearly," said the chevalier.
"Perhaps he is in Madame's apartments?"
inquired Fouquet. "Not in Madame's apartments, I should think, for I just now met with Madame as she was entering by the small staircase, and unless the gentleman whom you a moment ago encountered was the king himself—" and the chevalier paused, hoping that, in this manner, he might learn who it was he had been hurrying after. But Fouquet, whether he had or had not recognized De Guiche, simply replied, "No, monsieur, it was not the king." The chevalier, disappointed in his expectation, saluted them; but as he did so, casting a parting glance around him, and perceiving M. Colbert in the center of a group, he said to the superintendent, "Stay, monsieur, there is someone under the trees yonder who will be able to inform you better than myself."
"Who?"
asked Fouquet, whose nearsightedness prevented him from seeing through the darkness. "Monsieur Colbert," returned the chevalier.
"Indeed? That person, then, who is speaking yonder to those men with torches in their hands, is Monsieur Colbert?"
"Monsieur Colbert himself. He is giving orders personally to the workmen who are arranging the lamps for the illuminations."
"Thank you,"
said Fouquet, with an inclination of his head, which indicated that he had obtained all the information he wished. The chevalier, on his side, having on the contrary learned nothing at all, withdrew with a profound salutation. He had scarcely left when Fouquet, knitting his brows, fell into a deep reverie. Aramis looked at him for a moment with a mingled feeling of compassion and silence. "What?" he said to him. "The fellow's name alone seemed to affect you. Is it possible that, full of triumph and delight as you were just now, the sight merely of that man is capable of dispiriting you? Tell me, have you faith in your good star?"
"No," replied Fouquet, dejectedly.
"Why not?"
"Because I am too full of happiness at this present moment," he replied, in a trembling voice. "You, my dear D'Herblay, who are so learned, will remember the history of a certain tyrant of Samos. What can I throw into the sea to avert approaching evil? Yes, I repeat it once more, I am too full of happiness, so happy that I wish for nothing beyond what I have. I have risen so high, you know my motto, quo non ascendam. I have risen so high that nothing is left me but to descend from my elevation. I cannot believe in the progress of a success already more than human."
Aramis smiled as he fixed his kind and penetrating glance upon him. "If I were aware of the cause of your unhappiness," he said, "I should probably fear for your grace; but you regard me in the light of a true friend. I mean, you turn to me in misfortune, nothing more. Even that is an immense and precious boon, I know; but the truth is, I have a just right to beg you to confide in me, from time to time, any fortunate circumstances that befall you, in which I should rejoice, you know, more than if they had befallen myself."
"My dear prelate," said Fouquet, laughing, "my secrets are of too profane a character to confide them to a bishop, however great a worldling he may be."
"Bah! In confession?"
"Oh, I should blush too much if you were my confessor."
And Fouquet began to sigh. Aramis again looked at him without further betrayal of his thoughts than a placid smile. "Well," he said, "discretion is a great virtue."
"Silence," said Fouquet; "yonder venomous reptile has recognized us, and is crawling this way."
"Colbert?"
"Yes. Leave me, D'Herblay; I do not wish that fellow to see you with me, or he will take an aversion to you."
Aramis pressed his hand, saying, "What need have I of his friendship while you are here?"
"Yes, but I may not always be here," replied Fouquet, dejectedly.
"On that day, then, if that day should ever dawn," said Aramis, tranquilly, "we will think over a means of dispensing with the friendship, or of braving the dislike of Monsieur Colbert."
But tell me, my dear Fouquet, instead of conversing with this reptile, as you did him the honor of styling him, a conversation the need for which I do not perceive, why do you not pay a visit, if not to the king, at least to Madame?" "To Madame?" said the superintendent, his mind occupied by his souvenirs. "Yes, certainly, to Madame." "You remember," continued Aramis, "that we had been told that Madame stands high in favor during the last 2 or 3 days. It enters into your policy, and forms part of our plans, that you should assiduously devote yourself to his majesty's friends. It is a means of counteracting the growing influence of Monsieur Colbert. Present yourself, therefore, as soon as possible to Madame, and, for our sakes, treat this ally with consideration." "But," said Fouquet, "are you quite sure that it is upon her that the king has fixed his eye at the present moment?" "If the needle has turned, it must be since the morning. You know I have my police." "Very well, I will go there at once, and at all events I shall have a means of introduction in the shape of a magnificent pair of antique cameos set with diamonds." "I have seen them, and nothing could be more costly and regal." At this moment they were interrupted by a servant, followed by a courier. "For you, monseigneur," said the courier aloud, presenting a letter to Fouquet. "For your grace," said the lackey in a lower tone, handing Aramis a letter. And as the lackey carried a torch in his hand, he placed himself between the superintendent and the Bishop of Vannes, so that both of them could read at the same time. As Fouquet looked at the fine and delicate writing on the envelope, he started with delight. Those who love, or who are beloved, will understand his anxiety in the first place, and his happiness in the next. He hastily tore open the letter, which, however, contained only these words: "It is but an hour since I quitted you. It is an age since I told you how much I love you." And that was all. Madame de Belliere had, in fact, left Fouquet about an hour previously, after having passed 2 days with him, and apprehensive lest his remembrance of her might be effaced for too long a period from the heart she regretted, she dispatched a courier to him as the bearer of this important communication. Fouquet kissed the letter, and rewarded the bearer with a handful of gold. As for Aramis, he, on his side, was engaged in reading, but with more coolness and reflection, the following letter: "The king has this evening been struck with a strange fancy. A woman loves him. He learned it accidentally, as he was listening to the conversation of this young girl with her companions, and his majesty has entirely abandoned himself to his new caprice. The girl's name is Mademoiselle de la Valliere, and she is sufficiently pretty to warrant this caprice becoming a strong attachment. Beware of Mademoiselle de la Valliere." There was not a word about Madame. Aramis slowly folded the letter and put it in his pocket. Fouquet was still delightedly inhaling the perfume of his epistle. "Monseigneur," said Aramis, touching Fouquet's arm. "Yes, what is it?" he asked. "An idea has just occurred to me. Are you acquainted with a young girl of the name of La Valliere?" "Not at all." "Reflect a little." Yes, I believe so. One of Madame's maids of honor." "That must be the one." "Well, what then?"
"Well, monseigneur, it is to that girl that you must pay your visit this evening."
"Bah! Why so?"
"Nay, more than that, it is to her you must present your cameos."
"Nonsense."
"You know, monseigneur, that my advice is not to be regarded lightly."
"But this unforeseen—"
"That is my affair. Pay your court in due form, and without loss of time, to Mademoiselle de la Valliere. I will be your guarantee with Madame de Belliere that your devotion is altogether politic."
"What do you mean, my dear D'Herblay, and whose name have you just pronounced?"
"A name which ought to convince you that, as I am so well informed about yourself, I may possibly be just as well informed about others. Pay your court, therefore, to La Valliere."
"I will pay my court to whomsoever you like," replied Fouquet, his heart filled with happiness.
"Come, come, descend again to the earth, traveler in the seventh heaven," said Aramis. "Monsieur Colbert is approaching. He has been recruiting while we were reading. See how he is surrounded, praised, congratulated. He is decidedly becoming powerful."
In fact, Colbert was advancing, escorted by all the courtiers who remained in the gardens, every one of whom complimented him upon the arrangements of the fete, all of which so puffed him up that he could hardly contain himself. "If La Fontaine were here," said Fouquet, smiling, "what an admirable opportunity for him to recite his fable of 'the frog that wanted to make itself as big as the ox.'" Colbert arrived in the center of the circle blazing with light. Fouquet awaited his approach, unmoved, and with a slightly mocking smile. Colbert smiled too. He had been observing his enemy during the last quarter of an hour, and had been approaching him gradually. Colbert's smile was a presage of hostility. "Oh, oh," said Aramis, in a low tone of voice to the superintendent, "the scoundrel is going to ask you again for more millions to pay for his fireworks and his colored lamps." Colbert was the first to salute them, and with an air which he endeavored to render respectful. Fouquet hardly moved his head.
"Well, monseigneur, what do you say? Have we shown our good taste?"
"Perfect taste," replied Fouquet, without permitting the slightest tone of raillery to be remarked in his words.
"Oh," said Colbert maliciously, "you are treating us with indulgence. We are poor, we are servants of the king, and Fontainebleau is no way to be compared as a residence with Vaux."
"Quite true," replied Fouquet coldly.
"But what can we do, monseigneur?" continued Colbert. "We have done our best on slender resources."
Fouquet made a gesture of assent.
"But,"
pursued Colbert,
"it would be only a proper display of your magnificence, monseigneur, if you were to offer his majesty a fete in your wonderful gardens, in those gardens which have cost you 60 millions of francs."
72, said Fouquet.
"An additional reason," returned Colbert. "It would indeed be truly magnificent."
"But do you suppose, monsieur, that his majesty would deign to accept my invitation?"
"I have no doubt whatever of it," cried Colbert hastily. "I will guarantee that he does."
"You are exceedingly kind," said Fouquet. "I may depend on it, then?"
"Yes, monseigneur, yes, certainly."
"Then I will consider the matter," yawned Fouquet. "Accept, whispered Aramis eagerly.
"You will consider?" repeated Colbert.
"Yes," replied Fouquet, "in order to know what day I shall submit my invitation to the king."
"This very evening, monseigneur, this very evening."
"Agreed," said the superintendent. "Gentlemen, I should wish to issue my invitations, but you know that wherever the king goes, the king is in his own palace. It is by his majesty, therefore, that you must be invited." A murmur of delight immediately arose. Fouquet bowed and left.
"Proud and dauntless man," thought Colbert, "you accept, and yet you know it will cost you 10 millions."
"You have ruined me," whispered Fouquet in a low tone to Aramis. "I have saved you," replied the latter, whilst Fouquet ascended the flight of steps, and inquired whether the king was still visible. Chapter 46. Of 10 years later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eden Ray-Hedrick. 10 Years Later, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 47. The Orderly Clerk. The king, anxious to be quite alone, in order to reflect well upon what was passing in his heart, had withdrawn to his own apartments, where M. de Saint Aignan had, after his conversation with Madame, gone to meet him. This conversation has already been related. The favorite, vain of his twofold importance, and feeling that he had become, during the last 2 hours, the confidant of the king, began to treat the affairs of the court in a somewhat indifferent manner, and, from the position in which he had placed himself, or rather, where chance had placed him, he saw nothing but love and garlands of flowers around him. The king's love for Madame, that of Madame for the king, that of Guiche for Madame, that of La Valliere for the king, that of Malicorne for Montalais, that of Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente for himself, was not all this, truly, more than enough to turn the head of any courtier? Besides, Saint Aignan was the model of courtiers, past, present, and to come, and, moreover, showed himself such an excellent narrator, and so discerningly appreciative, that the king listened to him with an appearance of great interest, particularly when he described the excited manner with which Madame had sought for him to converse about the affair of Mademoiselle de la Valliere. While the king no longer experienced for Madame any remains of the passion he had once felt for her, there was, in this same eagerness of Madame to procure information about him, great gratification for his vanity, from which he could not free himself. He experienced this pleasure then, but nothing more, and his heart was not for a single moment alarmed at what Madame might, or might not, think of his adventure. When, however, Saint Aignan had finished, the king, while preparing to retire to rest, asked, "Now, Saint Aignan, you know what Mademoiselle de la Valliere is, do you not?"
"Not only what she is, but what she will be."
"What do you mean?"
"I mean that she is everything that a woman can wish to be, that is to say, beloved by your majesty. I mean that she will be everything your majesty may wish her to be."
"That is not what I am asking. I do not wish to know what she is today, or what she will be tomorrow. As you have remarked, that is my affair. But tell me what others say of her."
"They say she is well conducted."
"Oh," said the king, smiling, "that is mere report."
"But rare enough at court, sire, to believe when it is spread."
"Perhaps you are right. Is she well born?"
"Excellently. The daughter of the Marquis de la Valliere, and stepdaughter of that good Monsieur de Saint Remy."
"Ah, yes, my aunt's major domo. I remember, and I remember now that I saw her as I passed through Blois. She was presented to the queens. I have even to reproach myself that I did not on that occasion pay her the attention she deserved."
"Oh, sire, I trust that your majesty will now repair time lost."
"And the report, you tell me, is that Mademoiselle de la Valliere never had a lover?"
"In any case, I do not think your majesty would be much alarmed at the rivalry."
"Yet stay," said the king in a very serious tone of voice.
"Your majesty?"
"I remember."
"Ah."
"If she has no lover, she has, at least, a betrothed."
"A betrothed?"
"What, count, do you not know that?"
"No."
"You, the man who knows all the news?"
"Your majesty will excuse me. You know this betrothed, then?"
"Assuredly. His father came to ask me to sign the marriage contract. It is—" The king was about to pronounce the Vicomte de Bragelonne's name when he stopped and knitted his brows.
"It is?"
repeated Saint Aignan inquiringly. "I don't remember now," replied Louis XIV, endeavoring to conceal an annoyance he had some trouble to disguise.
"Can I put your majesty in the way?" inquired the Comte de Saint Aignan.
"No, for I no longer remember to whom I intended to refer. Indeed, I only remember very indistinctly that one of the maids of honor was to marry. The name, however, has escaped me."
"Was it Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente he was going to marry?" inquired Saint Aignan.
"Very likely," said the king.
"In such a case the intended was Monsieur de Montespan, but Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente did not speak of it. It seemed to me in such a manner as would frighten suitors away."
"At all events," said the king, "I know nothing, or almost nothing, about Mademoiselle de la Valliere. Saint Aignan, I rely upon you to procure me every information about her."
"Yes, sire. And when shall I have the honor of seeing your majesty again to give you the latest news?"
"Whenever you have procured it."
"I shall obtain it speedily, then, if the information can be as quickly obtained as my wish to see your majesty again."
"Well said, count. By the by, has Madame displayed any ill feeling against this poor girl?"
"None, sire."
"Madame did not get angry, then?"
"I do not know. I only know that she laughed continually."
"That's well. But I think I hear voices in the anterooms. No doubt a courier has just arrived. Inquire, Saint Aignan." The count ran to the door and exchanged a few words with the usher. He returned to the king, saying,
"Sire, it is Monsieur Fouquet, who has this moment arrived by your majesty's orders, he says.
He presented himself, but, because of the lateness of the hour, he does not press for an audience this evening, and is satisfied to have his presence formally announced." "Monsieur Fouquet? I wrote to him at 3 o'clock, inviting him to be at Fontainebleau the following day, and he arrives at Fontainebleau at 2 o'clock in the morning. This is indeed zeal!" exclaimed the king, delighted to see himself so promptly obeyed. "On the contrary, Monsieur Fouquet shall have his audience. I summoned him, and will receive him. Let him be introduced. As for you, count, pursue your inquiries, and be here tomorrow." The king placed his finger on his lips, and Saint Aignan, his heart brimful of happiness, hastily withdrew, telling the usher to introduce Monsieur Fouquet, who, thereupon, entered the king's apartment. Louis rose to receive him. "Good evening, Monsieur Fouquet," he said, smiling graciously. "I congratulate you on your punctuality, and yet my message must have reached you late." "At 9 in the evening, sire." "You have been working very hard lately, Monsieur Fouquet, for I have been informed that you have not left your rooms at Saint Mande during the last 3 or 4 days." "It is perfectly true, your majesty, that I have kept myself shut up for the past 3 days," replied Fouquet. "Do you know, Monsieur Fouquet, that I had a great many things to say to you?" continued the king, with a most gracious air. "Your majesty overwhelms me, and since you are so graciously disposed towards me, will you permit me to remind you of the promise you made to grant an audience?" "Ah, yes, some church dignitary who thinks he has to thank me for something, is it not?" "Precisely so, sire. The hour is, perhaps, badly chosen, but the time of the companion whom I have brought with me is valuable, and as Fontainebleau is on the way to his diocese—" "Who is it, then?" "The Bishop of Vannes, whose appointment your majesty, at my recommendation, deigned, 3 months since, to sign." "That is very possible," said the king, who had signed without reading. "And he is here?" "Yes, sir. Vannes is an important diocese. The flock belonging to this pastor needed his religious consolation. They are savages, whom it is necessary to polish at the same time as he instructs them, and Monsieur d'Herblay is unequaled in such kind of missions." "Monsieur d'Herblay," said the king musingly, as if his name, heard long since, was not, however, unknown to him. "Oh," said Fouquet promptly, "your majesty is not acquainted with the obscure name of one of your most faithful and valuable servants?" "No, I confess I am not. And so he wishes to set off again?" "He has this very day received letters which will, perhaps, compel him to leave, so that, before setting off for that unknown region called Bretagne, he is desirous of paying his respects to your majesty." "Is he waiting?" "He is here, sire." "Let him enter." Fouquet made a sign to the usher in attendance, who was waiting behind the tapestry. The door opened, and Aramis entered. The king allowed him to finish the compliments which he addressed to him, and fixed a long look upon a countenance which no one could forget, after having once beheld it. "Vannes," he said, "you are the Bishop of Vannes, I believe." "Yes, sire." "Vannes is in Bretagne, I think?" Aramis bowed. "Near the coast?" Aramis again bowed. "A few leagues from Belle Isle, is it not?" "Yes, sire," replied Aramis. 6 leagues, I believe." 6 leagues, a mere step, then," said Louis XIV. "Not for us poor Bretons, sire," replied Aramis. 6 leagues, on the contrary, is a great distance, if it be 6 leagues on land, and an immense distance if it be leagues on sea. Besides, I have the honor to mention to your majesty that there are 6 leagues of sea from the river to Belle Isle." "It is said that Monsieur Fouquet has a very beautiful house there?" inquired the king. "Yes, it is said so," replied Aramis, looking quietly at Fouquet. "What do you mean, 'it is said so'?" exclaimed the king. "He has, sire." "Really, Monsieur Fouquet, I must confess that one circumstance surprises me." "What may that be, sire?" "That you should have at the head of the diocese a man like Monsieur d'Herblay, and yet should not have shown him Belle Isle." "Oh, sire," replied the bishop, without giving Fouquet time to answer, "we poor Breton prelates seldom leave our residences." "Monsieur de Vannes," said the king, "I will punish Monsieur Fouquet for his indifference." "In what way, sire?" "I will change your bishopric." Fouquet bit his lips, but Aramis only smiled. "What income does Vannes bring you?" continued the king. 60,000 livres, sire," said Aramis. "So trifling an amount as that, but you possess other property, Monsieur de Vannes?" "I have nothing else, sire, only Monsieur Fouquet pays me 1,200 livres a year for his pew in the church." Well, Monsieur d'Herblay, I promise you something better than that. Sire, I will not forget you. Aramis bowed, and the king also bowed to him in a respectful manner, as he was accustomed to do towards women and members of the church. Aramis gathered that his audience was at an end. He took his leave of the king in the simple, unpretending language of a country pastor, and disappeared. He is indeed a remarkable face, said the king, following him with his eyes as long as he could see him, and even to a certain degree when he was no longer to be seen. Sire, replied Fouquet, if that bishop had been educated early in life, no prelate in the kingdom would deserve the highest distinctions better than he. His learning is not extensive, then? He changed the sword for the crucifix, and that rather late in life. But it matters little, if your majesty will permit me to speak of Monsieur de Vin again on another occasion. I beg you to do so, but before speaking of him, let us speak of yourself, Monsieur Fouquet. Of me, sire? Yes, I have to pay you 1,000 compliments. I cannot express to your majesty the delight with which you overwhelm me. I understand you, Monsieur Fouquet. I confess, however, to have had certain prejudices against you. In that case I was indeed unhappy, sire. But they exist no longer. Did you not perceive? I did indeed, sire, but I awaited with resignation the day when the truth would prevail, and it seems that that day has now arrived. Ah, you know, then, you were in disgrace with me? Alas, sire, I perceived it. And do you know the reason? Perfectly well. Your majesty thought that I had been wastefully lavish in expenditure. Not so, far from that. Or rather, an indifferent administrator. In a word, you thought that, as the people had no money, there would be none for your majesty either. Yes, I thought so, but I was deceived. Fouquet bowed. And no disturbances? No complaints? And money enough, said Fouquet. The fact is that you have been profuse with it during the last month. I have more, not only for your majesty's requirements, but for all your caprices. I thank you, Monsieur Fouquet, replied the king seriously. I will not put you to the proof. For the next 2 months I do not intend to ask you for anything. I will avail myself of the interval to amass 5 or 6 millions, which will be serviceable as money in hand in case of war. 5 or 6 millions? For the expenses of your majesty's household only, be it understood. You think war probable, Monsieur Fouquet? I think that if heaven has bestowed on the eagle a beak and claws, it is to enable him to show his royal character. The king blushed with pleasure. We have spent a great deal of money these past few days, Monsieur Fouquet. Will you not scold me for it? Sire, your majesty has still 20 years of youth to enjoy, and 1,000 million francs to lavish in those 20 years. That is a great deal of money, Monsieur Fouquet, said the king. I will economize, sire. Besides, your majesty has 2 valuable servants in Monsieur Colbert and myself. The one will encourage you to be prodigal with your treasures, and this shall be myself, if my service shall continue to be agreeable to your majesty, and the other will economize money for you, and this will be Monsieur Colbert's province. Monsieur Colbert? returned the king, astonished. Certainly, sire, Monsieur Colbert is an excellent accountant. At this commendation, bestowed by the traduced on the traducer, the king felt himself penetrated with confidence and admiration. There was not, moreover, either in Fouquet's voice or look, anything which injuriously affected a single syllable of the remark he had made. He did not pass one eulogium, as it were, in order to acquire the right of making 2 reproaches. The king comprehended him, and yielding to so much generosity and address, he said, "You praise Monsieur Colbert, then?" "Yes, sire, I praise him, for, besides being a man of merit, I believe him to be devoted to your majesty's interests." "Is that because he has often interfered with your own views?" said the king, smiling. "Exactly, sire." "Explain yourself." "It is simple enough. I am the man who is needed to make the money come in, he is the man who is needed to prevent it leaving." "Nay, nay, monsieur le surintendant, you will presently say something which will correct this good opinion." "Do you mean as far as administrative abilities are concerned, sire?" "Yes." "Not in the slightest." "Really?" "Upon my honor, sire, I do not know throughout France a better clerk than Monsieur Colbert." This word clerk did not possess in 1661 the somewhat subservient significance attached to it in the present day, but, as spoken by Fouquet, whom the king had addressed as the superintendent, it seemed to acquire an insignificant and petty character, that at this juncture served admirably to restore Fouquet to his place, and Colbert to his own. "And yet," said Louis XIV, "it was Colbert, however, that, notwithstanding his economy, has the arrangement of my fetes here at Fontainebleau, and I assure you, Monsieur Fouquet, that in no way has he checked the expenditure of money." Fouquet bowed, but did not reply. "Is it not your opinion, too?" said the king. "I think, sire," he replied, "that Monsieur Colbert has done what he had to do in an exceedingly orderly manner, and that he deserves, in this respect, all the praise your majesty may bestow upon him." The word orderly was a proper accompaniment for the word clerk. The king possessed that extreme sensitiveness of organization, that delicacy of perception, which pierced through and detected the regular order of feelings and sensations before the actual sensations themselves, and he therefore comprehended that the clerk had, in Fouquet's opinion, been too full of method and order in his arrangements; in other words, that the magnificent fetes of Fontainebleau might have been rendered more magnificent still. The king consequently felt that there was something in the amusements he had provided with which some person or another might be able to find fault. He experienced a little of the annoyance felt by a person coming from the provinces to Paris, dressed out in the very best clothes which his wardrobe can furnish, only to find that the fashionably dressed man there looks at him either too much or not enough. This part of the conversation, which Fouquet had carried on with so much moderation, yet with extreme tact, inspired the king with the highest esteem for the character of the man and the capacity of the minister. Fouquet took his leave at 2:45 in the morning, and the king went to bed a little uneasy and confused at the indirect lesson he had received, and a good hour was employed by him in going over again in memory the embroideries, the tapestries, the bills of fare of the various banquets, the architecture of the triumphal arches, the arrangements for the illuminations and fireworks, all the offspring of the clerk Colbert's invention. The result was, the king passed in review before him everything that had taken place during the last 8 days, and decided that faults could be found in his fates. But Fouquet, by his politeness, his thoughtful consideration, and his generosity, had injured Colbert more deeply than the latter, by his artifice, his ill will, and his persevering hatred, had ever yet succeeded in hurting Fouquet. Chapter 47.
Of 10 Years Later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eden Ray Hedrick. 10 Years Later, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 48. Fontainebleau at 2 o'clock in the morning. As we have seen, Saint Aignan had quitted the king's apartment at the very moment the superintendent entered it. Saint Aignan was charged with a mission that required dispatch, and he was going to do his utmost to turn his time to the best advantage. He whom we have introduced as the king's friend was indeed an uncommon personage. He was one of those valuable courtiers whose vigilance and acuteness of perception threw all other favorites into the shade, and counterbalanced, by his close attention, the servility of Dangeau, who was not the favorite, but the toady of the king. Monsieur de Saint Aignan began to think what was to be done in the present position of affairs. He reflected that his first information ought to come from De Guiche. He therefore set out in search of him, but De Guiche, whom we saw disappear behind one of the wings, and who seemed to have returned to his own apartments, had not entered the chateau. Saint Aignan therefore went in quest of him, and after having turned and twisted and searched in every direction, he perceived something like a human form leaning against a tree. This figure was as motionless as a statue, and seemed deeply engaged in looking at a window, although its curtains were closely drawn. As this window happened to be Madame's, Saint Aignan concluded that the form in question must be that of De Guiche. He advanced cautiously, and found he was not mistaken. De Guiche had, after his conversation with Madame, carried away such a weight of happiness that all of his strength of mind was hardly sufficient to enable him to support it. On his side, Saint Aignan knew that De Guiche had had something to do with La Valliere's introduction into Madame's household, for a courtier knows everything and forgets nothing, but he had never learned under what title or conditions De Guiche had conferred his protection upon La Valliere. But, as in asking a great many questions it is singular if a man does not learn something, Saint Aignan reckoned upon learning much or little, as the case might be, if he questioned De Guiche with that extreme tact and, at the same time, with that persistence in attaining an object of which he was capable. Saint Aignan's plan was as follows. If the information obtained was satisfactory, he would inform the king, with alacrity, that he had lighted upon a pearl, and claimed the privilege of setting the pearl in question in the royal crown. If the information was unsatisfactory, which, after all, might be possible, he would examine how far the king cared about La Valliere, and make use of his information in such a manner as to get rid of the girl altogether, and thereby obtain all the merit of her banishment with all the ladies of the court who might have the least pretensions to the king's heart, beginning with Madame and finishing with the queen. In case the king should show himself obstinate in his fancy, then he would not produce the damaging information he had obtained, but would let La Valliere know that his damaging information was carefully preserved in a secret drawer of her confidante's memory. In this manner he would be able to air his generosity before the poor girl's eyes, and so keep her in constant suspense between gratitude and apprehension to such an extent as to make her a friend at court, interested, as an accomplice, in trying to make his fortune while she was making her own. As far as concerned the day when the bombshell of the past should burst, if ever there was any occasion, Saint Aignan promised himself that he would by that time have taken all possible precautions, and would pretend an entire ignorance of the matter to the king, while, in regard to La Valliere, he would still have an opportunity of being considered the personification of generosity. It was with such ideas as these, which the fire of covetousness had caused to dawn in half an hour, that Saint Aignan, the son of earth, as La Fontaine would have said, determined to get De Guiche into conversation; in other words, to trouble him in his happiness, a happiness of which Saint Aignan was quite ignorant. It was long past 1 o'clock in the morning when Saint Aignan perceived De Guiche standing, motionless, leaning against the trunk of a tree, with his eyes fastened upon the lighted window, the sleepiest hour of night time, which painters crown with myrtles and budding poppies, the hour when eyes are heavy, hearts throb, and heads feel dull and languid, an hour which casts upon the day which has passed away a look of regret, while addressing a loving greeting to a lighting dawn. For De Guiche it was a dawn of unutterable happiness. He would have bestowed a treasure upon a beggar had one stood before him, to secure him uninterrupted indulgence in his dreams. It was precisely at this hour that Saint Aignan, badly advised, selfishness always counsels badly, came and struck him on the shoulder, at the very moment he was murmuring a word, or rather, a name.
"Ah!" he cried loudly, "I was looking for you."
"For me?" said De Guiche, starting.
"Yes, and I find you seemingly moonstruck. Is it likely, my dear comte, you have been attacked by a poetical malady, and are making verses?"
The young man forced a smile upon his lips, while 1,000 conflicting sensations were muttering defiance of Saint Aignan in the deep recesses of his heart. "Perhaps," he said, "but by what happy chance—"
"Ah, your remark shows that you did not hear what I said."
"How so?"
"Why, I began by telling you I was looking for you."
"You were looking for me?"
"Yes, and I find you now in the very act."
"Of doing what, I should like to know?"
"Of singing the praises of Phyllis."
"Well, I do not deny it," said De Guiche, laughing. "Yes, my dear comte, I was celebrating Phyllis's praises."
"And you have acquired the right to do so."
"I?"
"You, no doubt of it. You, the intrepid protector of every beautiful and clever woman."
"In the name of goodness, what story have you got hold of now?"
"Acknowledged truths, I am well aware. But stay a moment. I am in love."
"You?"
"Yes."
"So much the better, my dear comte. Tell me all about it." And De Guiche, afraid that Saint Aignan might perhaps presently observe the window, where the light was still burning, took the comte's arm and endeavored to lead him away.
"Oh," said the latter, resisting, "do not take me towards those dark woods. It is too damp there. Let us stay in the moonlight."
And while he yielded to the pressure of De Guiche's arm, he remained in the flower garden adjoining to the chateau. "Well," said De Guiche, resigning himself, "lead me where you like, and ask me what you please."
"It is impossible to be more agreeable than you are."
And then, after a moment's silence, Saint Aignan continued.
"I wish you to tell me something about a certain person in whom you have interested yourself."
"And with whom you are in love?"
"I will neither admit nor deny it. You understand that a man does not very readily place his heart where there is no hope of return, and it is most essential he should take measures of security in advance."
"You are right," said De Guiche with a sigh. "A man's heart is a very precious gift."
"Mine particularly is very tender, and in that light I present it to you."
"Oh, you are well known, comte. Well?"
"It is simply a question of Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente." Why, my dear Saint Aignan, you are losing your senses, I should think. Why so? I have never shown or taken any interest in Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente. Bah! Never. Did you not obtain admission for Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente into Madame's household? Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente, and you ought to know it better than anyone else, my dear comte, is of a sufficiently good family to make her presence here desirable, and her admittance very easy. You are jesting. No, and upon my honor, I do not know what you mean. And you had nothing then to do with her admission? No. You do not know her? I saw her for the first time the day she was presented to Madame. Therefore, as I have never taken any interest in her, as I do not know her, I am not able to give you the information you require. And De Guiche made a movement as though he were about to leave his questioner. Nay, nay, one moment, my dear comte, said Saint Aignan. You shall not escape me in this manner. Why, really, it seems to me that it is now time to return to our apartments. And yet, you were not going in when I did not meet you, but found you. Therefore, my dear comte, said De Guiche, as long as you have anything to say to me, I place myself entirely at your service. And you are quite right in doing so. What matters half an hour more or less? Will you swear that you have no injurious communications to make to me about her, and that any injurious communications you might possibly have to make are not the cause of your silence? Oh, I believe the poor child to be as pure as crystal. You overwhelm me with joy, and yet I do not wish to have towards you the appearance of a man so badly informed as I seem. It is quite certain that you supplied the princess's household with the ladies of honor. Nay, a song even has been written about it. Oh, songs are written about everything. Do you know it? No, sing it to me, and I shall make its acquaintance. I cannot tell you how it begins. I only remember how it ends. Very well, at all events, that is something. When maids of honor happen to run short, lo, Guiche will furnish the entire court. The idea is weak and the rhyme poor, said De Guiche. What can you expect, my dear fellow? It is not Racine or Molière, but La Feuillades, and a great lord cannot rhyme like a beggarly poet. It is very unfortunate, though, that you only remember the termination. Stay, stay. I have just recollected the beginning of the second couplet. Why, there's a birdcage with a pretty pair, the charming Montalais and La Valliere, exclaimed Guiche, impatiently, and completely ignorant, besides, of Saint Aignan's object. Yes, yes, you have it. You have hit upon the word La Valliere. Her grand discovery, indeed. Montalais and La Valliere, these, then, are the two young girls in whom you interest yourself, said Saint Aignan, laughing. And so Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente's name is not to be met with in the song? No, indeed. And are you satisfied, then? Perfectly, but I find Montalais there, said Saint Aignan, still laughing. Oh, you will find her everywhere. She is a singularly active young lady. You know her? Indirectly. She was the protégée of a man named Malicorne, who is a protégé of Manicamp's. Manicamp asked me to get the situation of maid of honor for Montalais in Madame's household, and a situation for Malicorne as an officer in Monsieur's household. Well, I asked for the appointments. You know very well that I have a weakness for that droll fellow Manicamp. And you obtained what you sought? For Montalais, yes. For Malicorne, yes and no, for as yet he is only on trial. Do you wish to know anything else? The last word of the couplet still remains, La Valliere, said Saint Aignan, resuming the smile that so tormented Guiche. Well, said the latter, it is true that I obtained admission for her in Madame's household. Ah, said Saint Aignan. But, continued Guiche, assuming a great coldness of manner, you will oblige me, comte, not to jest about that name. Mademoiselle la Bonne Leblanc de la Valliere is a young lady perfectly well conducted. Perfectly well conducted, do you say? Yes. Then you have not heard the last rumor? Exclaimed Saint Aignan. No, and you would do me a service, my dear comte, in keeping this report to yourself and to those who circulate it. Ah, bah, you take the matter up very seriously. Yes, Mademoiselle de Valliere is beloved by one of my best friends. Saint Aignan started. Aha, he said. Yes, comte, continued Guiche, and consequently you, the most distinguished man in France for polished courtesy of manner, will understand that I cannot allow my friend to be placed in a ridiculous position.
Saint Aignan began to bite his nails, partially from vexation and partially from disappointed curiosity. Guiche made him a very profound bow.
"You send me away," said Saint Aignan, who was dying to know the name of the friend. "I do not send you away, my dear fellow. I am going to finish my lines to Phyllis." "On those lines are a quatrain. You understand, I trust, that a quatrain is a serious affair?" "Of course." "And as of these 4 lines, of which it is composed, I have yet 3½ to make, I need my undivided attention." "I quite understand. Adieu, comte. By the by." "What?" "Are you quick at making verses?"
"Wonderfully so."
"Will you have quite finished the 3 lines and a half by tomorrow morning?"
"I hope so."
"Adieu, then, until tomorrow."
"Adieu, adieu." Saint Aignan was obliged to accept the notice to quit. He accordingly did so, and disappeared behind the hedge. Their conversation had led Guiche and Saint Aignan a good distance from the chateau. Every mathematician, every poet, and every dreamer has his own subjects of interest. Saint Aignan, on leaving Guiche, found himself at the extremity of the grove, at the very spot where the outbuildings of the servants began, and where, behind the thicket of acacias and chestnut trees interlacing their branches, which were hidden by masses of clematis and young vines, the wall which separated the woods from the courtyard was erected. Saint Aignan, alone, took the path which led towards these buildings, De Guiche going off in the opposite direction. The one proceeded to the flower garden, while the other bent his steps toward the walls. Saint Aignan walked on between rows of mountain ash, lilac, and hawthorn, which formed an almost impenetrable roof above his head. His feet were buried in the soft gravel and thick moss. He was deliberating a means of taking his revenge, which seemed difficult for him to carry out, and was vexed with himself for having not learned more about La Valliere, notwithstanding the ingenious measure he had resorted to in order to acquire more information about her, when suddenly the murmur of a human voice attracted his attention. He heard whispers, the complaining tones of a woman's voice, mingled with entreaties, smothered laughter, sighs, and half-stilted exclamations of surprise, but above them all the woman's voice prevailed. Saint Aignan stopped to look about him. He perceived from the greatest surprise that the voices proceeded, not from the ground, but from the branches of the trees. As he glided along under the covered walk, he raised his head, and observed at the top of the wall a woman perched upon a ladder, in eager conversation with a man seated in a branch of a chestnut tree, whose head alone could be seen, the rest of his body being concealed in the thick covert of the chestnut. End of chapter 48. Of 10 Years Later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eden Ray Hedrick. 10 Years Later by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 49. The Labyrinth. Saint Aignan, who had only been seeking for information, had met with an adventure. This was indeed a piece of good luck. Curious to learn why, and particularly what about, this man and woman were conversing at such an hour and in such a singular position, Saint Aignan made himself as small as he possibly could, and approached almost under the rounds of the ladder. And taking measures to make himself as comfortable as possible, he leaned his back against a tree and listened, and heard the following conversation. The woman was the first to speak. "Really, Monsieur Manicamp," she said in a tone which, notwithstanding the reproaches she addressed to him, preserved a marked tone of coquetry, "really, your indiscretion is of a very dangerous character. We cannot talk long in this manner without being observed."
"That is very probable," said the man in the calmest and coolest of tones.
"In that case, then, what would people say? Oh, if anyone were to see me, I declare I should die of very shame."
"Oh, that would be very silly. I do not believe you would."
"It might have been different if there had been anything between us, but to injure myself gratuitously is really very foolish of me. So adieu, Monsieur Manicamp."
"So far, so good. I know the man, and now let me see who the woman is," said Saint Aignan, watching the rounds of the ladder, on which were standing 2 pretty little feet covered with blue satin shoes. "Nay, nay, for pity's sake, my dear Montalais," cried Manicamp, "deuce take it, do not go away. I have a great many things to say to you, of the greatest importance still." "Montalais," said Saint Aignan to himself, "one of the three. Each of the three gossips had her adventure, only I imagined the hero of this one's adventure was Malicorne and not Manicamp." At her companion's appeal, Montalais stopped in the middle of her descent, and Saint Aignan could observe the unfortunate Manicamp climb from one branch of the chestnut tree to another, either to improve his situation or to overcome the fatigue consequent upon his inconvenient position. "Now listen to me," he said. "You quite understand, I hope, that my intentions are perfectly innocent?"
"Of course. But why did you write me a letter stimulating my gratitude towards you? Why did you ask me for an interview at such an hour and in such a place as this?"
"I stimulated your gratitude in reminding you that it was I who had been the means of your becoming attached to Madame's household, because most anxiously desirous of obtaining the interview you have been kind enough to grant me, I employed that means which appeared to me the most certain to ensure it. And my reason for soliciting it at such an hour and in such a locality was, that the hour seemed to me to be the most prudent, and the locality the least open to observation. Moreover, I had occasion to speak to you upon certain subjects which require both prudence and solitude."
"Monsieur Manicamp!"
"But everything I wish to say is perfectly honorable, I assure you."
"I think, Monsieur Manicamp, it will be more becoming in me to take my leave."
"No, no, listen to me, or I will jump from my perch here to yours, and be careful how you set me at defiance, for a branch of this chestnut tree causes me a good deal of annoyance, and may provoke me to extreme measures. Do not follow the example of this branch, then, but listen to me."
"I am listening, and I agree to do so, but be as brief as possible, for if you have a branch of the chestnut tree which annoys you, I wish you to understand that one of the rounds of the ladder is hurting the soles of my feet, and my shoes are being cut through."
"Do me the kindness to give me your hand."
"Why?"
"Will you have the goodness to do so?"
"There is my hand, then, but what are you going to do?"
"To draw you towards me."
"What for? You surely do not wish me to join you in the tree?"
"No, but I wish you to sit down upon the wall. There, that will do. There is quite room enough, and I would give a great deal to be allowed to sit down beside you."
"No, no, you are very well where you are. We should be seen."
"Do you really think so?" said Manicamp, in an insinuating voice.
"I am sure of it."
"Very well, I remain in my tree, then, although I cannot be worse placed."
"Monsieur Manicamp, we are wandering away from the subject."
"You are right, we are so."
"You wrote me a letter."
"I did."
"Why did you write?"
"Fancy, at 2 o'clock today, De Guiche left."
"What then?"
"Seeing him set off, I followed him, as I usually do."
"Of course, I see that, since you are here now."
"Don't be in a hurry. You are aware, I suppose, that De Guiche is up to his very neck in disgrace?"
"Alas, yes."
"It was the very height of imprudence on his part, then, to come to Fontainebleau to seek those who had at Paris sent him away into exile, and particularly those from whom he had been separated."
"Monsieur Manicamp, you reason like Pythagoras."
"Moreover, De Guiche is as obstinate as a man in love can be, and he refused to listen to any of my remonstrances. I begged, I implored him, but he would not listen to anything. Oh, the deuce!"
"What is the matter?"
"I beg your pardon, Mademoiselle Montalais, but this confounded branch, about which I have already had the honor of speaking to you, has just torn a certain portion of my dress."
"It is quite dark," replied Montalais, laughing. "So pray continue, Monsieur Manicamp."
De Guiche set off on horseback as hard as he could, I following him at a slower pace. You quite understand that to throw oneself into the water, for instance, with a friend, at the same headlong rate as he himself would do it, would be the act either of a fool or a madman. I therefore allowed De Guiche to get in advance, and I proceeded on my way with a commendable slowness of pace, feeling quite sure that my unfortunate friend would not be received, or, if he had been, that he would ride off again at the very first cross, disagreeable answer, and that I should see him returning much faster than he went, without having, myself, gone much farther than Ris or Melun. And even that was a good distance, you will admit, for it is 11 leagues to get there, and as many to return." Montalais shrugged her shoulders. "Laugh as much as you like, but if instead of being comfortably seated on the top of the wall as you are, you were sitting on this branch as if you were on horseback, you would, like Augustus, aspire to descend."
"Be patient, my dear Monsieur Malicorne. A few minutes will soon pass away. You were saying, I think, that you had gone beyond Ris and Melun."
Yes, I went through Rie and Melun, and I continued to go on, more and more surprised that I did not see him returning, and here I am at Fontainebleau. I look for and inquire after De Guiche everywhere, but no one has seen him, no one in the town has spoken to him. He arrived riding at full gallop, he entered the chateau, and there he has disappeared. I have been here at Fontainebleau since 8 o'clock this evening, inquiring for De Guiche in every direction, but no De Guiche can be found. I am dying with uneasiness. You understand that I have not been running my head into the lion's den in entering the chateau, as my imprudent friend has done. I came at once to the servants' offices, and I succeeded in getting a letter conveyed to you. And now, for heaven's sake, my dear young lady, relieve me of my anxiety."
There will be no difficulty in that, my dear Monsieur Manicamp. Your friend De Guiche has been admirably received.
Bah!
The king made quite a fuss over him.
The king, who exiled him?
Madame smiled upon him, and Monsieur appears to like him better than ever.
Ah, said Manicamp. That explains to me, then, why and how he has remained. And did he not say anything about me?
Not a word.
That is very unkind. What is he doing now?
In all probability, he is asleep, and if not asleep, dreaming.
And what have they been doing all the evening?
Dancing.
The famous ballet? How did De Guiche look?
Superb.
Dear fellow. And now, pray forgive me, Mademoiselle Montalais, but all I now have to do is pass from where I now am to your apartment.
What do you mean?
I cannot suppose that the door of the chateau will be opened for me at this hour, and as for spending the night upon this branch, I possibly might not object to do so, but I declare it is impossible for any other animal than a boa constrictor to do it.
But, Monsieur Manicamp, I cannot introduce a man over the wall in that manner.
Two, if you please, said a second voice, but in so timid a tone that it seemed as if its owner felt the utter impropriety of such a request.
Good gracious! Exclaimed Montalais. Who is that speaking to me?
Malicorne, Mademoiselle Montalais. And as Malicorne spoke, he raised himself from the ground to the lowest branches, and thence to the height of the wall.
Monsieur Malicorne! Why, you are both mad!
How do you do, Mademoiselle Montalais? Inquired Malicorne.
I needed but this, said Montalais in despair.
Oh, Mademoiselle Montalais, murmured Malicorne, do not be so severe, I beseech you. In fact, said Manicamp, we are your friends, and you cannot possibly wish your friends to lose their lives, and to leave us to pass the night on these branches is, in fact, condemning us to death.
Oh, said Montalais, Monsieur Malicorne is so robust that a night passed in the open air with the beautiful stars above him will not do him any harm, and it will be a just punishment for the trick he has just played me.
Be it so, then. Let Malicorne arrange matters with you in the best way he can. I pass over, said Manicamp. And bending down the famous branch against which he had directed such bitter complaints, he succeeded, by the assistance of his hands and feet, in seating himself side by side with Montalais, who tried to push him back, while he endeavored to maintain his position, and moreover, he succeeded. Having taken possession of the ladder, he stepped onto it, then gallantly offered his hand to his fair antagonist. While this was going on, Malicorne had installed himself in the chestnut tree, in the very place Manicamp had just left, determining within himself to succeed him in the one he now occupied. Manicamp and Montalais descended a few rounds of the ladder, Manicamp insisting, and Montalais laughing and objecting. Suddenly Malicorne's voice was heard in tones of entreaty. I entreat you, Mademoiselle Montalais, not to leave me here. My position is very insecure, and some accident will be certain to befall me if I attempt unaided to reach the other side of the wall. It does not matter if Manicamp tears his clothes, for he can make use of Monsieur de Guiche's wardrobe, but I shall not be able to use even those belonging to Monsieur Manicamp, for they will be torn. In my opinion, said Manicamp, without taking any notice of Malicorne's lamentations, is that the best thing to be done is to go and look for De Guiche without delay, for, by and by, perhaps, I may not be able to get to his apartments.
That is my own opinion, too, replied Montalais. So go at once, Monsieur Manicamp.
1,000 thanks. Adieu, Mademoiselle Montalais, said Manicamp, jumping to the ground. Your condescension cannot be repaid.
Farewell, Monsieur Manicamp. I am now going to get rid of Monsieur Malicorne.
Malicorne sighed. Manicamp went away a few paces, but returning to the foot of the ladder, he said, By the by, how do I get to Monsieur de Guiche's apartments?
Nothing is easier. You go along by the hedge until you reach a place where the paths cross.
Yes.
You will see 4 paths.
Exactly.
One of which you are to take.
Which of them?
That to the right.
That to the right?
No, to the left.
The deuce!
No, no, wait a minute.
You do not seem to be quite sure. Think again, I beg.
You take the middle path.
But there are 4.
So there are. All I know is that one of the 4 paths leads straight to Madame's apartments, and that one I am well acquainted with.
But Monsieur de Guiche is not in Madame's apartments, I suppose?
No, indeed.
Well, then the path which leads to Madame's apartments is of no use to me, and I would willingly exchange it for the one that leads to where Monsieur de Guiche is lodging.
Of course, and I know that as well, but as for indicating it from where we are, it is quite impossible.
Well, let us suppose that I have succeeded in finding that fortunate path.
In that case, you are almost there, for you have nothing else to do but cross the labyrinth.
Nothing more than that? The deuce! So there is a labyrinth as well?
Yes, and complicated enough, too. Even in daylight, one may sometimes be deceived. There are turnings and windings without end. In the first place, you must turn 3 times to the right, then twice to the left, then turn once. Stay, is it once or twice, though? At all events, when you get clear of the labyrinth, you will see an avenue of sycamores, and this avenue leads straight to the pavilion in which Monsieur de Guiche is lodging.
Nothing could be more clearly indicated, said Manicamp, and I have not the slightest doubt in the world that if I were to follow your instructions, I should lose my way immediately. I have, therefore, a slight service to ask of you.
But what may that be?
That you will offer me your arm and guide me yourself, like another, I used to know mythology, but other important matters have made me forget it. Pray, come with me, then. And am I to be abandoned, then? Cried Malicorne.
It is quite impossible, monsieur, said Montalais to Manicamp. If I were to be seen with you at such an hour, what would be said of me?
Your own conscience would acquit you, said Manicamp sententiously.
Impossible, monsieur, impossible.
In that case, let me assist Malicorne to get down. He is a very intelligent fellow, and possesses a very keen scent. He will guide me, and if we lose ourselves, both of us will be lost, and the one will save the other. If we are together and should be met by anyone, we shall look as if we had some matter of business in hand, whilst alone I should have the appearance either of a lover or a robber. Come, Malicorne, here is the ladder. Malicorne had already stretched out one of his legs toward the top of the wall, when Manicamp said in a whisper, "Hush!"
"What's the matter?" inquired Montalais.
"I hear footsteps."
"Good heavens!"
In fact, the fancied footsteps soon became a reality. The foliage was pushed aside, and Saint Aignan appeared, with a smile on his lips and his hand stretched out towards them, taking everyone by surprise, that is to say, Malicorne upon the tree, with his head stretched out, Montalais upon the round of the ladder and clinging to it tightly, and Manicamp on the ground, with his foot advanced, ready to set off. "Good evening, Manicamp," said the comte. "I am glad to see you, my dear fellow. We missed you this evening, and a good many inquiries have been made about you. Mademoiselle de Montalais, your most obedient servant." Montalais blushed.
"Good heavens!"
she exclaimed, hiding her face in both her hands. "Pray reassure yourself. I know how perfectly innocent you are, and I shall give a good account of you. Manicamp, do you follow me? The hedge, the cross paths, and the labyrinth. I am well acquainted with them all. I will be your Ariadne. There now, your mythological name is found at last."
"Perfectly true, comte." "And take Monsieur Malicorne away with you at the same time," said Montalais.
"No, indeed," said Malicorne. "Monsieur Manicamp has conversed with you as long as he liked, and now it is my turn, if you please. I have a multitude of things to tell you about our future prospects." "You hear," said the comte, laughing. "Stay with him, Mademoiselle Montalais. This is, indeed, a night for secrets." And taking Manicamp's arm, the comte led him rapidly away in the direction of the road Montalais knew so well and indicated so badly. Montalais followed them with her eyes as long as she could perceive them. Chapter 49.